The Canon R7 is a fantastic little camera, but it does come with a few challenges, especially when it comes to the buffer and the autofocus. So setting it up the right way is very important to get the best results in the field. Over the last little while, we've talked about the R7 a lot on this channel, but I've never actually shared my most successful settings with you. So let's change that today. In this video, I will share the most important R7 settings with you that will allow you to set up your camera to get the best results. And if you're interested in seeing all the things I've changed, I've linked a PDF guide for you down there in the description that will allow you to set up your R7 exactly like mine. So let's jump right in and start with the red menu. The first item is a good one straight away because here we can decide if we want to use RAW or C-RAW. And personally, I like to set it to C-RAW simply because it will allow me to shoot longer because it takes longer before I hit the buffer. In the second menu, I basically turn all the little helpers off. The next interesting menu is the fourth one. Here I like to set a custom white balance, usually around 5200, 5400 Kelvin. That allows me to always get consistent results in the field, but you can also leave it on auto white balance if you prefer that, because if you're shooting RAW, you can change the white balance afterwards anyways. Personally, I also like to work in the Adobe RGB color space, so I set the color space internally to Adobe RGB, but this is something else that you can change later on. So whether you shoot sRGB or Adobe RGB is personal preference at this stage. The next item that's quite interesting here is the picture style. If you're shooting RAW, the picture style doesn't actually affect the photos you're taking, but it does affect what the JPEG preview on the back of your camera looks like. The standard profile is pretty good because it gives me decent colors to look at and good sharpness. In the fifth menu, I just turn everything off again. In the sixth menu, I also disable everything, but here's one interesting item, the RAW burst mode. This is the pre-burst mode where with half pressing the shutter button, you already start taking images for half a second before you actually press the shutter button. So if you're photographing a bird that wants to take off and you kind of missed the moment, with this feature, you might actually get it. There's only one problem with this feature, and that is that you cannot shoot after you've been using it before the buffer is cleared. So if you're in RAW burst mode and you're half pressing the shutter button, you can kind of see your buffer filling up itemized on the left-hand side of your viewfinder, which is pretty cool. And if you're fully pressing the shutter button, you can see how the buffer starts filling up. And then if you let go, it means that now you have to wait until the buffer is clear before you can shoot again. This is the main reason that I'm not using the RAW burst mode in the field, because I don't like being blocked from shooting and having to wait until the buffer is clear to be able to shoot again. The next menu is a very important one and a bit of a confusing one with the R7 because there's a few considerations here to make. With this camera, we have three different shutter modes: the mechanical shutter, the first curtain electronic shutter, and the electronic shutter. The mechanical shutter on this camera works quite well, but unfortunately it's very loud and it has a lot of shutter shake. So whenever you take images, especially at lower shutter speeds, you can kind of see the vibration just from the shutter in your shots, and it's ruining a lot of low light, lower shutter speeds kind of shots. So the mechanical shutter is not one that I would recommend in this camera, especially because it's also very noisy. The second shutter mode, and one that I use a fair bit on the R7, is the first curtain electronic shutter, and overall, that probably gives me the best results. The only downside with this is that it's not as fast. It only shoots at 15 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second that the electronic shutter can do. But at the same time, it doesn't give me the distorted images and image wobbles that the electronic shutter gives me, and has less shutter shake than the mechanical shutter. So we get overall better results, and I would recommend most of the time using the first curtain electronic shutter unless you need the camera to be silent. Then I would go for the electronic shutter. And lastly, we have the electronic shutter, which is great for action because you get 30 frames per second of a bird flying past you really fast. You got a lot of different wing poses, but the downside is that with the electronic shutter, we have a lot of rolling shutter. We have a lot of sort of image wobbles and distorted images, but at the same time, we also get silent shooting and the highest frame rate. So personally, I always switch between the first curtain electronic shutter and the electronic shutter. Sometimes when I know there will be fast action and I need a really high frame rate, I would recommend using the electronic shutter. But if I'm photographing something, for instance, a hummingbird at a flower, and I know rolling shutter will be an issue, I would probably go for the slightly slower electronic first curtain shutter because all the wings of the birds won't be distorted. Or if you have a lot of straight lines in your background, they will all be on an angle. In this camera, I think it's important to switch between the first curtain and the electronic shutter mode depending on the situation. We will talk about the autofocus a little bit later in this video, but there's an unofficial statement from Canon in regards to some focusing issues that people are experiencing with the R7, where it will focus on the bird, jump off, jump back on, jump on something else. So you don't get that consistently sharp photos. You have the camera kind of jumping on and off. And apparently this happens the worst at the higher frame rate. So something in the sensor or the autofocus is not sort of capable of keeping up with the high frame rate, giving you worse results. And apparently, according to Canon, lowering your frame rate and using the first curtain electronic shutter will give you the best results. So instead of using 15 frames per second, you might even use 8 frames per second with the first curtain electronic shutter, which will then give you probably the best autofocusing results. The only downside then is that obviously the camera is quite slow and you have a noticeable blackout in the viewfinder. So there's some drawbacks, but I just wanted to mention that the slower the frame rate, the better the R7 should be focusing. But personally, I haven't really dialed it back that much because it's just too slow for me in the field, and I've been using mainly 15 or 30 frames per second and still gotten good results with the autofocus settings we will look at in a minute. In the 8th menu, I've turned off the digital image stabilization, the auto level. Here you can also customize your quick control, which is the Q button on the back of your camera. Whenever you click that, you see certain items coming up, and if you want different items coming up, you can change that here in this menu. I disabled the touch shutter because that's very annoying. That means whenever you click on the rear screen, the camera will actually take a photo, which is super annoying, so I turned that off. And I've also turned off the image review because it just drains the battery and I find it confusing. And when I actually want to look at an image, I can just press the replay button rather than the camera always showing me a review of the image. The 9th menu doesn't look like much, but there's actually a lot of hidden sub-menus in this menu. So the first item, the display simulation, I set to exposure and depth of field. The next item that's very interesting is the shooting info display. And if we click in there, we can actually select what we see in the viewfinder and on the back of the camera. And there's some very helpful items that you can activate or turn off. For instance, personally, I don't like toggling through too many different options, so I disable a few options here and just leave something like the histogram activated, but turn off some of the other options that I never use, especially on the rear screen. So how you set this up is basically your personal preference, but if there's an item in the viewfinder you don't want to see or an item you want to see, this is the menu where you can change that. Here you can also set if you want to see grid display in your viewfinder or not, which is very useful for landscapes, probably not that useful for bird photography. And another item here is also very important, the histogram. And here I like to set the histogram to small because the standard is quite big and I think it's too distracting in my viewfinder. So I go in here, set the histogram to brightness and the size to small. So now I just have a small histogram in my viewfinder that allows me to monitor my exposure without being distracting. And the last item in the 9th menu is the display performance, and I set that to smooth. So at least whenever the camera can, it gives me the highest refresh rate in the viewfinder. And the last tab allows us to change some movie settings. However, this is just the settings that happen when you press the red button on top of the camera while you're in photo mode. And I wouldn't really do that on the R7 because it just films in some weird automatic mode. What I would do always is switch to video and we go later through those settings. With a camera like the R7, where we sometimes get a little bit more noisy RAW files, or they're not 100% in focus, or the colors are not quite right, it's important that we learn image editing to get the absolute most out of the photos we're taking. And I would love to help you save time and get the best results with my Pro Sets and my Masterclass. With my Pro Sets, I allow you to transform your sometimes dull and not perfect looking RAW files with just one click into a great starting point for the editing process. And in my Masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop about image editing and how to adjust colors, how to remove color cast, how to use selective colors, the liquefiers, curves, and so on. I know both of these will help you tremendously, so make sure to check them out down there in the description if you want to take your image editing to the next level. The next menu, the pink autofocusing menu, is probably the most important one. And here I like to set up my cameras in a certain way. On all my Canon cameras, I use double back button autofocusing. So that means I disable the focusing on the shutter button and I focus with the AF on button and the star button on the back of your camera. So whenever you half press the shutter button, the camera only meters and you're focusing with the rear buttons, and when you want to take a photo, then you press the shutter button and the camera will take the photos. By separating it this way, it allows me to have full control over the autofocusing. My base autofocus is the spot autofocus. It's one little autofocusing field in the middle of the camera that I can move all over my viewfinder, quite similar to the old sort of DSLR autofocus. And I set it up that way because it gives me full control over the autofocus. So if your R7, for instance, is stuck on the background, you can quickly press the star button and get it back to your subject or near your subject, and then engage the eye tracking again for best results. And of course, the other button, the AF on button, I set up to the eye tracking. So whenever I press the AF on button, the camera will jump from the base autofocusing mode to spot autofocus into the eye tracking mode and will find the subject all over the viewfinder and track it, and ideally track the bird's head and the bird's eye. So you basically get the best of both worlds. Whenever we press the AF on button, we get the fantastic eye tracking, which I would also recommend for birds in flight, for instance. And if we let go, we're diverting back to the base autofocus that allows us to have full control over the autofocus and focus on whatever we want in case the eye tracking doesn't work. How to assign these buttons, I'll show you in the orange menu later on, but for now, let's go through the autofocusing settings in the pink menu. I set the AF operation to AI server because I want the camera to follow the bird all over the viewfinder and also follow it if it changes distance. The AF area I set to spot autofocus. This is also something you can do on the quick menu on the back of the camera. I turned the subject tracking off because I only want the camera to track when I press the AF on button and don't start tracking when I'm in my base autofocusing spot mode. If you engage the subject tracking here, the camera will actually also start tracking when you're in the spot autofocusing mode, but that's something I don't want to do because I want to have maximum control in the spot autofocusing mode. The subject to detect here I set to animals. If you're photographing people, you want to set it to people, but here you want to set it to animals. And I turn off the eye tracking because again, I don't need the eye tracking in my base autofocusing mode, but later on in the other menu, when we assign the AF on button, we will activate the eye tracking on that button. So now for the base autofocusing mode, we turn it off, but later on we set it up and turn it on. And the last item is already an interesting one, the switch tracked subjects. And I've set that to 0. So it means whenever I focus on something, the camera sticks as long with that as possible. And usually that gives me better results and the camera jumps off slightly less. If you have that set to 2, for instance, the camera constantly kind of looks for something else to kind of focus on, and it's a little bit more jumpy, and it is also more distracted quickly by a branch coming through or another bird entering the frame. So setting it to 0 has given me the best results here. The next tab is a very interesting one because we can change how quickly the autofocus reacts to changes and how sort of hyperactive it is. I like to use case 1 and I like to set the acceleration, deceleration and the tracking sensitivity to -2 in both cases here on the R7. On my other cameras, I usually set it to -1, but on the R7 I seem to have getting better results setting it to -2. So the camera's fairly slow to react and not so hyperactive and sticks to your subject a little bit more. If you set this to +2, for instance, you notice how the focus just wants to sort of jump around, and this is definitely not what we want with the R7. So case 1 and then setting the tracking sensitivity and the acceleration, deceleration to -2 each gives me the best results. To actually be able to change these settings, you have to press the rate button on the back of the camera. In the fourth menu, I've personally disabled the touch and drag autofocus, but it can be quite handy at times because instead of using the joystick to move your autofocusing points around, you can also assign an area on the back of the screen where you can then move the autofocus fields around with your thumb if that's something that you want to do. So if you feel like moving the autofocus points with a thumb on the rear screen while holding the camera to your face, this is where you would change it. Otherwise, you can just leave it disabled. And lastly, the orientation linked autofocusing points is also an important item that I like to set to separate autofocusing points area and point. So whenever I focus vertically and set a focusing point and go back to horizontal and back to vertical, I'll still have the same point activated in vertical, and also the point which I activated in horizontal will still be there if I go to vertical and back. The sixth menu has an interesting one, the electronic full-time manual focus, and you want to set that to enabled because otherwise you won't be able to manually interfere with the focusing with your RF lenses. The standard is off, but it would definitely enable that because on a 100 to 500mm lens, for instance, if this is not enabled, you won't be able to use the manual focus ring and manually adjust if your camera gets stuck on the background, for instance. So I think that's important to turn that on. In the blue menu, I don't change much, but one interesting one is the magnification in the 5th tab. Here, if I go in there, I like to select the actual size. So whenever I press the rear view and then the magnifying glass on the back of the camera, it jumps onto 100% rear view. So it allows me to then quickly make sure that the image is sharp in the field on the back of the camera. And then the last menu, the 6 blue tab, there's a few interesting ones as well. One is the blinkies, the highlight alerts. I definitely would activate those because that shows you whenever there's blown out areas in your photos, you see that blinking, and that's very important. And then you can also select, for instance, if you want to have your autofocus point displayed on the back of the camera to see whether the camera focused in the right spot. But that's something that I personally find a bit annoying, so I have that turned off. The purple menu I don't change too much because it's just when you want to connect your camera to your phone, for instance. In the yellow menu, number 2, there you have something that's kind of interesting for video, especially if you're filming inside, and that's whether you'll set your camera to the PAL standard or the NTSC standard. If you're in North America, you want to set your camera to NTSC, which determines your frame rate for video. And if you're in a PAL country, you want to set it to PAL, which basically all countries other than North America are PAL countries. And it just means that you have 25 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second, for instance, in the base 4K mode. And this just helps with lights inside. For instance, if you're shooting at the wrong frame rate, you might get more flickering in your frame. So I would just set it accordingly to whichever country you're in. The third yellow menu is quite interesting as well, because here, for instance, you can set how loud the volume would be for the electronic shutter if you want to have a shutter sound or no shutter sound at all. And you can also set the power savings for the camera. So I usually like to turn off the screen dimmer and the screen off. And I set the auto power off and the viewfinder off to 1 minute to save battery on the R7 because we have no battery group available at the R7. So saving some battery from time to time is probably a good idea, and these settings will help. I don't change much else in the yellow menu, but in the 6 tab, that can be interesting if you want to have certain custom modes on your R7. For instance, if you're shooting people and animals and switch between the two quite frequently, it would make sense to have custom function 1 for animals, for instance, custom mode 2 for people. And to set that up, you first put all the settings that you want to have on your camera. Then you go to the 6th yellow item, go to custom shooting mode, and then go to register settings. Select which mode you want to select your current settings to, and then it will save it as that mode. And then if you want to register another mode, you go back to like manual, for instance, make all the changes, like set it up for people, for instance, so the eye tracking is for people. And then you go back into this yellow menu and save that as custom mode 2. And then we have one more interesting feature at the bottom of the custom mode, the auto update settings. And this can be very helpful or annoying for you. The auto update settings is disabled by default, but I always like to turn it on because it means that all changes I make while I'm in custom mode 1, for instance, will be automatically saved to custom mode 1. If you don't do that and you switch from custom mode 1 to custom mode 2, it will revert back to whatever you've saved as custom mode 1 initially. So in this regard, it really depends what you want. Do you always want the same settings for custom mode 1, or do you want to have changing settings depending on the situation and the camera always saving your latest settings? And now we come to the orange menu, which will be quite interesting because here we can finally assign the different buttons for the autofocusing. And we do that in the third orange menu, customize buttons. And the first item is the shutter button, and we want to set that to metering only. So when I half press the shutter button, the camera is not focusing, but only metering, and when I fully press it, then it's taking photos. But we want to disable the autofocusing from the shutter button to then be able to control it fully with the 2 buttons on the rear of the camera. So next we scroll down to the AF on button, and then in there toggle all the way through to eye detection autofocus and select that. So now whenever we press the AF on button on the back of the camera, it will start the eye detection, and the camera by itself will find the bird and jump onto the head or the animal or person or whatever you're setting up the camera for. And right below that, for the star button, we want to set up the autofocusing for our base autofocusing mode. So we click in there, and then we go to metering and autofocus start. And now whenever we press the star button, the camera will focus in our spot autofocusing mode. Because I don't really like the position of the ISO button on top of the R7, I've also made one more change. I've actually assigned the ISO to the top of that toggle on the back of the camera, the D-pad, because I find it easier to get to. So I go all the way down to the up arrow on the D-pad, and then in there I select ISO. So now whenever I'm on the back of the camera, I just press up here and then can quickly change the ISO with the wheel rather than having to find the button on top of the camera. And the next one is probably the most annoying thing on these mirrorless cameras that's set up as active by default, and it's called retract lens on power off. Has it ever happened to you that you're in the field, you pre-focus on something, your camera goes to sleep or you turn it off, and when you turn it back on, It's completely blurry because the camera completely defocused and you have to find your subject again. That has lost me a lot of images in the beginning until I realized this can be turned off. If you go to retract lens power off and disable it, the camera will now retain the focus. I think this is something that you should definitely change because there's no reason for the camera to lose focus when you turn it off. The only time this feature is useful if you have a lens like the Canon 35mm 1.8 for instance that actually protrudes out when shooting. If you disable the retract lens on power off, this lens will stay in the zoomed out position and can be damaged. So if you have a lens like this, leaving this feature on might be a good idea, but you could also, for instance, save it to a custom mode. So you have one mode for shooting with lenses where you want this feature disabled and one mode for lenses where you might need it enabled. And that's it when it comes to the photography side of things. We've now set up the camera with double back button autofocusing and made sure that our autofocus is not so sort of hyperactive anymore and sticks to our subject as much as possible. And we've also selected C-RAW so we get the maximum buffer capacities. And the only other thing you have to remember that sometimes we want to switch between the first curtain electronic shutter and the electronic shutter depending on the situation. And now let's look at some video settings. In the video menu, we don't have to make too many changes because a lot of changes are already carried over from the photo menu, but there's a few items that are important. The first red menu item is definitely where we want to select our frame rate and our resolution. And in here, I like to get the best possible quality, so I select the oversampled 4K fine, 25 frames per second because I'm in the PAL country, and the less compressed IPB mode, the first one. But in this menu, you can also select 4K 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second if you are in an NTSC country, or select 4K with crop or Full HD if you just want a lower resolution. If you actually want to shoot proper slow-mo at 100 or 120 frames per second, you have to go to the second menu item, high frame rate. That's off by default, but if you turn that on, it will record some nice slow motion video. However, slow motion at 120 frames per second is only available in Full HD on the R7, unfortunately. The third red tab in the video menu is also important because here we can select if we want to shoot in log or normal profile. If you don't want to do much video editing, then I would recommend not shooting in log, but if you want to get the most dynamic range out of your files and the best quality overall, shooting in log will be quite advantageous. The only thing is then you definitely have to edit your videos. They will look quite pale and flat out of the camera unless you edit them and put like LUTs and profiles and do some editing to them. And if you're not shooting in log and turn that off, you can now select which color profile you actually want to use for your video. And here I select neutral. The sixth red tab is also quite interesting because here we can set up our zebra settings, which is little black and white lines running through too dark or too bright areas, which can be very helpful for filming because with filming, we want to make sure that we have no blown out areas in our videos because they're not recoverable. Anything that's blown out in a video file is basically a hole in your movie and can't be recovered. Unlike photos where we want to kind of shoot a little bit too bright, with movies we always want to make sure that there's no clipped highlights at all. I like to use Zebra Pattern 1 and set the level 1 to 90 ±5 and level 2 to 90%. And the last item, the shooting info display, you can again select what you want to see in your viewfinder and the rear of your camera. Now it gets interesting when it comes to the movie autofocus. We want to set it up completely different because we want the camera to find the subject and track it by itself and continuously track it without us having to press any buttons because that will just usually introduce a lot of shake into your file. So you want to have the camera track everything by itself. So we set it up in a certain way. So we go movie server autofocus enable. AF area, we go to the whole area. Subject tracking we have on. Subject to detect animals. We also enable the eye tracking. And I've also changed the switch tracked subject to 0 from 1. In the next tab, I've left the autofocus settings the way they are by default. And that's pretty much it when it comes to setting up your R7 for video. Because it's a little bit more limited in terms of video features, there's not a lot to set up and there's not a lot of different sort of modes to choose from or resolutions to choose from. So setting up the R7 for video is actually quite easy. And with just a few tweaks to the autofocus we've made and selecting the right solution, you should be good to go and capturing some fantastic videos. And that brings this video already to an end. I hope these settings will help you to set up your own R7 in a way that you get fantastic photos in the field. If you like to read or want to look through all these settings again, make sure to check out my PDF guide down there in the description as well. Other than that, I would love to hear from you guys in the comments. What are your thoughts about the R7? How have you set up yours? Have you learned something new? Have you set it up differently? Make sure to let me know. Also check out my channel membership, where for a small monthly contribution, you can get some cool membership perks and support me directly. And also give me a thumbs up for the video and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.